We can look back at our lives and we can recount over and over again where we've decided we know better than God does, and we've walked a certain way only to find that we really don't know what we're doing. So we have to settle in our hearts as Christians and as believers that we have to allow God to be God. And therefore, no matter what our feelings will tell us or what our circumstances may say, He is to be trusted. His word is to be believed and to be followed. Not because it is always the easiest path, but rather because it is the best. Because He loves us. And the scope that He has compared to our extremely limited and finite scope is better to trust than what we see, what we know, what we've experienced in our limited vapor of a life. So, in the book of Job, in chapters 34 and 35, Elihu, the unnamed member of the troop of discoursers, dialogticians, or however we want to name them, the group of friends that are surrounding Job and listening to his plight as he wrestles with his suffering. Elihu is one that kind of just pops up almost out of nowhere, and he gives us a balance for humanity, especially in their historical context. He gives us a balance between Job and his friends, both acknowledging that bad things do happen and that God will give bad things in order to draw people to Himself. God will give suffering. He will cause fear in our life. He will cause things that feel out of control in order that we would turn to Him instead of relying on ourselves. Elihu, even though he is still without the full context of the gospel as far as Christ and His atoning work on our behalf, the work that Christ would finally do to be our righteousness so that we don't have to earn it on our own, he is without that knowledge because of the historical context in which he is in. But he gives us a much more balanced view than Job or Job's three friends. In chapters 35 and 36, he challenges us, 34 and 35, he challenges us to let God be God and to trust how He works. And that the full scope of how God works is not just in giving blessings to those who are good and giving commands and rules for us to follow, but rather that God will, in fact, in His faithfulness and His love, give us challenges, give us trials, give us suffering in order that we would find Him more dear than He was before. Chapters 36 and 37, he gives us the reason why we can trust this God who works in this way. Chapter 36, starting in verse 1, and Elihu continued and said, "Bear with me a little, and I will show you, for I have yet something to say on God's behalf. I will get my knowledge from afar and ascribe righteousness to my Maker. For truly my words are not false. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you." Now, Elihu is not here trying to say that he is perfection or he has perfected anything, but rather what he is saying is that the knowledge he has obtained is from the perfect one, been revealed to him by God in His creation. And that's where he is going to point us moving forward. Verse 5, "Behold, God is mighty and does not despise any. He is mighty and strength of understanding. He does not keep the wicked alive, but gives the afflicted their right. He does not withdraw His eyes from the righteous, but with kings on the throne He sets them forever, and they are exalted. If they are bound in chains and caught in the cords of affliction, then He declares to them their work and their transgressions, that they are behaving arrogantly. He opens their ears to instruction and commands that they return from iniquity. If they listen and serve Him, they complete their days in prosperity and their years in pleasantness. But if they do not listen, they perish by the sword and die without knowledge." Now here, again, we see the limited nature of Elihu. He is limited by his context. He is limited by his own personal historical context. He's also limited by his experiences. Because here, he sounds very much like many of Job and his friends, right? We see kind of this karma type thing going on. But he is wanting to bring balance, and as we've seen before, he is giving more credit to God as being righteous, even in giving people suffering and trials in order to draw them to Him. "The godless in heart cherish anger. They do not cry for help when he binds them. They die in youth, and their life ends among their cult prostitutes. He delivers the afflicted by their affliction and opens their ear by adversity. He also allured you out of distress into a broad place where there was no cramping, and what was set on your table was full of fatness. But you are full of the judgment on the wicked. Judgment and justice seize you. Beware, lest wrath entice you into scoffing, and let not the greatness of the ransom turn you aside. Will your cry for help avail to keep you from distress, or all the force of your strength? Do not long for the night when people vanish in their place. Take care. Do not turn to iniquity, for this you have chosen rather than affliction. Behold, God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? Who has prescribed for him his way? Or who can say, you have done wrong? Remember to extol his work, of which men have sung. All mankind has looked on it. Man beholds it from afar. Behold, God is great, and we know him not. The number of his years is unsearchable. For he draws up the drops of water. They distill his mist and rain, which the skies pour down and drop on mankind abundantly. Can anyone understand the spreading of the clouds, the thunderings of his pavilion? Behold, he scatters his lightning about him and covers the roots of the sea. For by these he judges peoples. He gives food in abundance. He covers his hands with lightning and commands it to strike the mark. Its crashing declares his presence. The cattle also declare that he rises. At this also my heart trembles and leaps out of its place. Keep listening to the thunder of his voice and the rumbling that comes from his mouth. Under the whole heaven he lets it go, and his lightning is to the corners of the earth. After it, his voice roars. He thunders with his majestic voice, and he does not restrain the lightnings when his voice is heard. God thunders wondrously with his voice. He does great things that we cannot comprehend. For to the snow he says, fall on the earth. Likewise to the downpour, his mighty downpour. He seals up the hand of every man, that all men whom he made may know it. Then the beasts go into their lairs and remain in their dens. From its chamber comes the whirlwind, and cold from the scattering winds. By the breath of God ice is given, and the broad waters are frozen fast. He loads the thick cloud with moisture. The cloud scatters his lightning. They turn around and around by his guidance to accomplish all that he commands them on the face of the habitable world. Whether for correction or for his land or for love, he causes it to happen. Hear this, O Job. Stop and consider the wondrous works of God. Do you know how God lays his command upon them and causes the lightning of his cloud to shine? Do you know the balancings of the clouds, the wondrous works of him who is perfect in knowledge? You whose garments are hot when the earth is still because of the south wind. Can you, like him, spread out the skies, hard as a cast metal mirror? Teach us what we shall say to him. We cannot draw up our case because of darkness. Shall it be told him that I would speak? Did a man ever wish that he would be swallowed up? And now no one looks on the light when it is bright in the skies, when the wind has passed and cleared them. Out of the north comes golden splendor. God is clothed with awesome majesty. The Almighty, we cannot find him. He is great in power, justice, and abundant righteousness. He will not violate. Therefore men fear him. He does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit. Elihu's answer to why we should allow God to be God is nature, the created world. Now, this is done differently than what Job's friends did. They always pointed to man's wisdom and what they had learned from ages past, or what they had learned by their own experience with some this or that. Elihu says, if we have this creation such as we do, we have the vastness of the skies and the heavens. We have nature that continues on its course, both in animals and in the natural courses of the weather and all these things. We see all these things, and we understand God to be the cause of them. Why would we not trust him with our lives when we see his power so displayed in the world, in creation? we as human beings have this struggle of believing we are far larger than we are. We believe very much that everything revolves around us, both people and things. Or it should. It's just broken. What Elihu calls us to is seeing ourselves rightly before a God who controls everything. From the falling of the rain to the frost, to the animals and how he gives them each what they need for survival. How when he is ready, he calls their breath and takes them from the earth. All of this being controlled by God. And why would we not then stand and allow him to be God in our lives? Elihu is teaching this far back before the age of reason, before we've reached all this apparent planes of enlightenment, of intellectual fortitude, or we now know how the processes of nature work. This is a message that is especially relevant for us today because we believe that we've somehow accomplished what only God can do. Or we now understand how he works. We are like God by our understanding. If we don't know it, by golly, we can Google it. How foolish we are so often in our lives in believing that we in ourselves know better or can do better than the God who by a word created the universe. See, Elihu says we can let God be God because of what he has done and shown us already. Psalm 19:1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God." Let me ask you the last time that you allowed that voice to reach you. When was the last time you marveled at the greatness of God in looking at the heavens? When was the last time you marveled at the growth of a tree from a tiny seed and glorified God for how great he must be to take such a tiny, insignificant thing and make it into the tree that it would become? See, we are so often desensitized to the beauty of the creation that exists around us because we've seen it on a PBS special. Because we've had some voiceover explain it to us as if they somehow figured it out or manufactured it on their own. See, we believe that by our knowledge over the centuries, we have somehow reached a level where God is no longer necessary, or we can at least argue with him on certain points in our lives. Where we could probably do just as well as he could in governing certain aspects. And this plays out in so many ways. This plays out in how we pick our jobs. We know better. We know this is probably a better opportunity because it has more money, because it's more comfortable for it, and it gets me out of this city. 3 things I was never going to do after I got out of college. Never going to work in a church. Never going to live overseas. Never going to live in a small town. Right? Small towns don't have enough to do for me. Not nearly as entertaining. Those are my plans before God, right? And I argued with him all the time about keeping those plans, right? So I moved to Grand Prairie. I worked at a school. I was not moving. Better money in Grand Prairie. Not going to work at a church. Definitely not going overseas. I might go for a mission trip, maybe down to Mexico, something like that, you know. Need some vanilla anyway. Then a year and a half, God had moved us to South Korea. 2 years of exile in South Korea. He moves us home, and he puts me in a ministry living in Glen Rose, Texas. If you've ever been to Glen Rose, it's a nice little tourist town. It's like 3,000 people. Maybe. Maybe not even that many. I don't even know. But I knew better coming out of college. Right? I'm an adult. And we could go around and we could probably just stand up and share the stories of all the times we've laid out our plans before God, and He's said, yeah, that's a good one. And don't we continue to try to make plans for ourselves? I look across this room, and just in the short years that I've known many of you, I could name things in your life. Ideas you thought you had about what you were going to do, and then all of a sudden God says, no, I have something better for you. Brothers and sisters, Elihu is calling us to trust God to be God in our lives, not just on blind faith, but rather recalling His majesty, recalling His greatness, recalling His power, all the way back to creation. The Word, He spoke the universe into existence. Don't you think He can handle your life? And if not, why not? If we so believe the things that we've heard for so long about who God is and what He has done, why can't we trust Him to be God in our lives? See, many of us, especially if we've grown up around church, we are more than ready to say that we believe all the children's stories about God, but we want to live our own lives. We're happy to believe that He created the Garden of Eden and brought the people out of Egypt and knocked the walls down at Jericho. But I don't think He's that big to tell me what I should do with my relationships. I don't think He quite sees well enough just how important I am and how smart I am to lead me to this place to live, or lead me to this job, or lead me to this way of doing ministry or reaching people around me. Elihu in these chapters is drawing our attention beyond even the experience of man to the things and the ways that God governs the universe, to help us believe that if we can trust Him to keep the stars shining, to keep the rain falling, to keep the oceans at bay, we can absolutely trust Him with our lives. This is a theme not just in the book of Job, and not just in Elihu's writings, but also in the pages of the rest of Scripture. And we're going to draw our attention to specifically where God uses not just mighty, wonderful works on behalf of His people to bring blessing, but rather where God uses affliction to draw people to Himself and to a deeper faith in Him. Psalm 119. We've talked about these verses before, but Psalm 119, verse 50 says this: "This is my comfort in my affliction, that your promise gives me life." Comfort in affliction. That the word, the promise, will give life. Even if that affliction ends in physical death, life is present. And we can take comfort in this. Verse 67, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word." Boy, don't we have testimony and testimony and testimony of this? I thought I was going the right way, and then this hit. God gave it to me. It hurt. It wasn't fun. And yet through it, I learned who He was. And yet through it, I learned to grow to love Him even in my affliction. And now, on the other side, after His work has been done through that affliction, I'm ready to keep His word. Verse 71, may it be that we would be able to say this with the psalmist, it is good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. See, God so orchestrates things for us that He will give us hard things in love in order to draw us to Himself. 2 Kings chapter 5. This is a story that is very different than much of the Old Testament tales. With the exception of maybe Jonah, we have very few interactions where we see God being gracious and revealing Himself to outsiders. Of course, we have Rahab, we have several, we have a few, just a handful. Here's one that's also significant. 2 Kings chapter 5, starting in verse 1. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, a foreign nation, an enemy of Israel, was a great man with his master and in high favor because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Bad news in those days, guys. Now, the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy. So Naaman went in and told his Lord, thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel. And the king of Syria said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothes. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, when this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy. And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me. But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, go, wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean. But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord of his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in rage. But his servants came near and said to him, my father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, wash and be clean? So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a child, and he was clean. Notice here the grace of God to this non-Israelite, this Gentile, as we would call him in more New Testament speech. We know because God governs all things, God gives leprosy to this man, a foreigner. Some form of skin disease that would have prevented him from living in polite society for much of it. I know probably the laws in Syria may have been different than the laws in Israel. He may not have been so outcast, but certainly it would have limited what he was able to do as far as social gatherings and not wanting to spread this leprosy to everyone. He hears about Elisha, the prophet of God, who can heal him. He comes with all his pomp, believing that he can purchase this healing. He can control the situation by bringing all of this money and clothes and all of his pageantry with him because he is a great man. And Elisha doesn't even come out to meet him. He doesn't even get a face-to-face with the prophet. Despite all his pageantry, despite how important he is, despite the position that he holds, despite the letters to the king, he doesn't get any of it. He gets a messenger with these silly instructions of dipping in a dirty river. Now we, in our modern day, we kind of glorify the Jordan River because it's where, Jesus was baptized, it's where John did his ministry. We kind of glorify it in Israel. You ever been there? It's just kind of a river. And not even a real pretty one. There are prettier ones in Colorado, California, Texas even, that look better to get into. You look at the Jordan at certain points of the year and you're just like, I'm good. Thanks. Yep, I'll go around. I'm all right. Yeah, there you go. Kind of like the drink. Just like, oh, good. Yeah. He even says it. He's like, listen, there are better rivers elsewhere. Why couldn't I have just stayed home and kind of just gone and washed myself there? God's word to him said, this is what you do. This is how you get healing. This is how you get a blessing from me. And he was angry at what God told him. Because it didn't meet his expectations. Because it wasn't pretty enough for him. Because it didn't feel like it was the right thing to do. He wanted Elisha to come out and do a magic trick. Presto. Clean skin. He wanted a show. He wanted everybody to be watching this great miracle that he had purchased by doing what he thought was the best thing to do and bringing gold and silver to the God of the universe who doesn't need any of it. Brothers and sisters, how many times have you brought worthless things to God and he's told you, this is what I need from you? It's not pretty. It's not what you were expecting. And it's not going to get you glory. Brothers and sisters, too often, God tells us, you want peace in your life? Here's what to do. Be with me. No. I need a better job to get peace because I need more money. No. What I need is for you to fix the crazy in my spouse. Then I can be at peace. No. What I need, and the list can go on and on. Then I can have peace. And what we hear from God is, listen, this is what gets you peace. Rejoice. Be thankful. Pray. Trust me. Well, let's look at the result. Naaman does finally, because of the help of his servant, who was not looking for this great grand miracle, this show and display, or for Naaman to be able to purchase his healing. Naaman goes and does, and he is healed. And then, verse 15, and he returned to the man of God. He and all his company, he came and stood before him, and he said, behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. This moment for Naaman was unique because for the first time, he didn't have to give to receive. Almost any other religion in the world demands that the worshiper first appease the gods before they can receive from the gods. You come and you bring the right offering, you get their attention. The bigger the miracle you need, the bigger the offering needs to be. Not so with our God. It's not the vastness of our wealth. It's not the extravagance of our offerings that moves God. It is His mercy towards us. He comes and He acknowledges through the affliction of leprosy, through the silliness in His mind of the dipping Himself in the Jordan, He comes to a knowledge of the God of the universe. This is an indictment on us. This is a man who knew nothing of God beforehand. He had to hear it from a slave girl. And yet he, more quickly often than we do, who sit in church every week and have grown up in this, he came to understand the workings of God far more quickly than often you and I will. Joel. Chapter 2. The book of Joel, the prophet Joel, is mostly about God destroying justly His people. It's a fun one, right? Everybody's favorite book, Joel. We actually, most of us, if you've grown up in church, we really appreciate a certain verse in Joel that then Paul quotes later on, and it's often misunderstood as to what is actually going on and even what the thrust of Paul is given. Joel has just been proclaiming that, listen, God is going to come and He's going to wreck this. He's going to destroy the nation. He's going to send you into exile. He's going to do that justly. It's going to hurt. It's going to sting. It's not going to feel good. You're welcome. But he says that God is not going to forget. He's not going to forget His people. He's not going to forget the promises that He made to Abraham. He's not going to forget. So he says this in verse 28 of Joel chapter 2, and it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female servants in those days I will pour out my Spirit. And I will show wonders in the heavens and on earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be those who escape, as the Lord has said, and among the survivors shall be those whom the Lord calls. God is going to give His very presence uniquely again to His people, but only after they have endured the suffering of His judgment. Now, God is talking about a people here, but the model is given for us as individuals in that God will often give us suffering as He seeks to reveal Himself. When we think about our salvation, many of us, it is our testimony that in that moment that He saved us, we felt the lowest we could be. Why? Because we knew we were sinners. God, by His grace, opened our eyes to see our need. And we were wrecked with it, knowing that we could not save ourselves. And then as God's Spirit was poured out upon us, we were able then to cry out to Him to save us. God uses suffering, affliction, trials to move our hearts to Him. Because only when we acknowledge our inability to do anything good, as Jesus tells us in John 15, only as we acknowledge that we need Him desperately will He meet us there. The great hope that we have is not that this life will be so comfortable, so easy, so filled with prosperity and health. The great hope that we have is that God will meet us in our need. And in meeting us, sustain us until the moment He deems to be right to take us to His glory. 2 Timothy chapter 4. If you would turn there and look there with me. I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by His appearing and His kingdom preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions. Boy, is this not true of us today. This word spoken almost 2,000 years ago speaks to us even now. Because, brothers and sisters, you do not have to go very far to find someone who would claim to be a Christian, claim to be a speaker on God's behalf, who will tell you what you want to hear about your life. You don't have to go very far at all. They're the best-selling books that we have in the Christian market today. They're the most listened to radio shows on Christian radio. You don't have to go very far to find someone who will, in the name of God, be okay with you leading your own life, loving who you want to love, doing what you want to do, chasing after what you want to chase after. You don't have to go very far. But you will come up empty. As for you, Paul says, always be sober-minded. Endure suffering. Do the work of an evangelist. Fulfill your ministry. Endure suffering. You want to know one of the primary causes of people leaving or appearing to leave our faith? When I say our faith, I mean orthodoxy. I mean the truth of the Scriptures. What has been true and remains to be true and will continue to be true long after we are gone. The thing that most often pulls people out to where they acknowledge they don't believe the Bible to be true anymore. They don't believe that Jesus to be the only way. They don't believe that God's word is true and that what He says we ought to do. The main thing is suffering. Either suffering that hits them personally, or the observance of suffering in people they love or in the world. Brothers and sisters, we will too often turn to things that are not God in our suffering. And so Paul warns us. Paul warns young Timothy, pastor, called to a specific ministry. You may not be called to pastoral ministry. You are called to a specific ministry. And brothers and sisters, you will be derailed from the ministry God has called you to if, when you hit suffering, or you see suffering in those you love or in the world outside, and you run to other places other than God to find peace for yourself. Paul continues, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." I have fought the good fight. Brothers and sisters, are you fighting the good fight today? In our struggle with our sin and our struggle with the sin in others and our struggle of living in a fallen and broken world where we are often reminded of how out of control we are we fighting back? Are we pushing back against that darkness, or are we caving into it? I'll tell you, I'll confess, that as I have confessed often, I struggle with depression, and there are days that I get swallowed by it. But praise be to Christ that there are more days now that by His grace I get to fight it. Do you believe? Do you trust that the God who is on our side is greater than anything else? Any depression, any anxiety, any sickness, and that we can fight the good fight. We can keep the faith no matter what this world has brought to us. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved His appearing. Elihu, in his final speech, in his last words to us, pushes us to trust the God who is in control of all things. Because it is imperative that as we fight the good fight, we fight not in our own strength or in our own abilities, because we will fail, but rather we fight using what God has given. When we covered in the book of Ephesians chapter 6, the armor of God. Armor that arms us to fight this fight. All of it central around His word. All of it having to believe that that word is true and able to fight back what is dark in this world and in our hearts. Brothers and sisters, again this morning we are to ask ourselves the question, are we okay with God being God? And brothers and sisters, we have given proofs this morning that He has proven Himself to be able to handle everything in our lives. Believe in Him. Trust Him. Put your faith in Him. And may it be that as we walk with Him, we will be obedient to His commands, trusting that what He has called us to is better than anything we could come up with on our own. Trust Him. Let's pray.